Hello, and welcome to the Morgan Latif podcast series, this time Diversity and Inclusion in Focus. I'm your host, Sam Latif, and this week my guest is Lisa Kepinski and Tinna Nielsen. They are both the founders of the Inclusion Nudges Global Initiative, and they developed the Inclusion Nudges a change approach based on their backgrounds in behavioral and social science. They're world-acclaimed experts in this space and have helped many organizations apply behavioral insights and design for impactful systemic cultural leadership and behavioral change, particularly in the fields in D&I. Their work has been acclaimed by a number of notable publications, and in 2021, they received an honorable mention for the Winds of Change Award from the Forum on Workplace Inclusion. They've worked with a range of organizations ranging from Amnesty International to the World Economic Forum, also with notable leaders and social entrepreneurs. And overall, their mission is to make inclusion the norm everywhere for everyone by everyone. So this week we talk on that Inclusion Nudges initiative that they started, their backgrounds and their journey and how that came to be. And overall, we have a fascinating discussion on some of the topics that they point out on their guidebooks, and particularly on some around the talent selection pieces. A really interesting and fascinating perspective with two true thought leaders in the space. And as always, I hope you find it of value. So Tinna and Lisa, thank you very much for being on the show with me today.
Thank you for inviting us.
So
Thank you.
I wanted to, I don't think I can do your backgrounds justice. So I wanted to first ask if you can just give us a bit of the origin story, right? I start the show every time like this. So maybe starting with you, Tinna, obviously when there's always three on this, it's always a different dynamic, but why don't you start us off and give us a bit of your background and really what led your journey into the D&I space?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question in itself, because sometimes Lisa and I, after having worked together for 8 years, we say, oh, I never heard that part of your life story. So you never know which part of it to tell. I think everybody working in this line of work have had some kind of personal experience that kind of, triggered something within them that just gave them this lifelong drive to try and contribute to making some changes for the greater good of all of us. And so is the same story for me. Basically, I had an older brother with severe dyslexia. The way the school system was dealing with that was very traumatic for the entire family. I myself, I'm 6'2" tall, or 185. And so I was always sticking out. And what I wanted the most in the entire world was really just to fit in and just be like everybody else. But it's very difficult when you had like a head taller than everybody else. So I think that's really where my journey started. It really triggered something in me that both for my brother and for me, where the turning point for us was from something very negative to something very positive, was that we met individual people who made a difference in our life. So for my brother, it was an English teacher who really believed in him. And for me, it was somebody who really thought I had potential in basketball. I mean, so again, and I was just so puzzled by that, my entire youth, that you were so dependent on meeting the right person at the right time. And I think all that led me to, study anthropology. It led me to, be curious about how we could design and live our lives differently, in harmony with all this diversity. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that part of my story for today, just to keep it short. Yeah.
Great. No, it gives us a good initial origin story, and we'll talk a little bit more about your background as we go through the conversation. But Lisa, how about yourself?
As Tinna said, it's always fascinating because at any point in time, that variations of that story get told. And Sam, I remember when we first talked with you, you were sharing with us about your own origin story and living in many places. And sometimes it's really hard to pinpoint who we are and why we are the way we are. I mean, I have images that flash through my mind from being raised in the US in the South. And at the age of 5, I vividly recall seeing a KKK cross being burnt in a field as we were returning from a very warm and lovely visit with an elderly aunt that I just adored. And that searing image of racism within the context of where I was raised, but equally I was raised in a family that moved every 2 years or 3 years. So similar to you, Sam, I know you moved a lot in your life, and that shapes kind of how we are. And Tinna and I have often talked about how we have felt throughout our life being the outsider. And being the outsider brings many experiences that can be valuable as a change maker. You have very heightened sense of observation. What the hell is going on here? You know, your brain is sorting constantly. You're the newcomer. Yeah. You're looking in, trying to figure out, okay, what's the code for fitting in with this group? What's the dynamic? And then what's it going to cost me or benefit me to join in with that group? And then before I know it, I'm moving on to another place. Yeah. And I've continued that pattern as well as a parent with my children. So yeah, let's focus on kind of what we learn from our experiences, how we can observe, how we can be part of group cohesion, coming together, integration, bringing people from the outside, or at times when we may say it's just safer and easier to be on the outside. A lot of that has shaped how I look at group dynamics and patterns of inclusion and exclusion. Academically, I went on to study social psychology and looking at dynamics in terms of how we're thinking and where are those influences coming from in terms of how we think and how we come together to create change within a society. And then I went on and did a master's degree in linguistics, gender linguistics, and looking at dynamics of male and female patterns and also looking at dynamics of immigrants into the US and patterns of cultural assimilation that happen in terms of what forms of language that we're teaching relative to the use of sexist language and what that reveals about culture. So I'll leave it there around a lot of what sums me up is looking from the outside, curiosity around what makes us think and tick and behave and how we operate individually and as groups and what that means societally.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because, you know, I think it's human nature to want to belong with a group, right? It's the tribal nature in everybody that if you don't belong to a tribe that back, you know, hundreds of years ago, hunter-gatherer days, then you're probably left for dead, right? And now we've made this progression that we want to celebrate diversity and uniqueness and inclusion. And now that's a message that I think is now carrying more and more weight. I mean, it's curious, given Lisa, you've obviously you grew up in the States, Tinna in Europe. Do you see the D&I, is there any differences, I think, from growing up in the US versus Europe and how that's shaped, obviously, how you see how global organizations are driving D&I? Because I was always curious. I always thought the US, because you're confronted with that conversation on a daily basis than Europe, it's probably more advanced. But I really don't know if that's the case. So I was curious to get your perspective on that.
Well, Tinna, you've also lived in the US in your time as well and have exposure. And we certainly have done our work with parts of the US, Europe, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Asia. I'll speak for myself first on the initial piece. So I've lived and worked in Europe for over 20 years and then had a long history also working in the field of diversity, equity, inclusion in the US. One thing that I picked up on when I first moved to Europe, and this is now 20 years ago, was I better get tight on my numbers. That conversation in the US around diversity, equity, inclusion is a lot of emotional laden words and still is, I think, driven around values, morals, right thing to do. And when I came into organizations and I worked in multinationals at the time, it was very much from the European leaders, what's the data, what's the evidence, show it to me, tell me, do you know the numbers, tell me where we're going, how does that inform where we're going? And that level of rigor around the data was not as dominant the discussion in the US, and I'll throw in Canada as well, so North America, where it was much more around a values-driven moral stance. And so it was adapting around that dynamic.
Interesting. Tina, how about yourself?
Well, so I live in Denmark, and there is a very strong self-perception that we are a very egalitarian country. And we are in the sense that everybody pays a lot in tax. That means everybody have equal access to free, high-level education throughout the entire school system, throughout university. Everybody has free healthcare and so on. But it has also established the flawed understanding that we also have equality in terms of everybody having equal opportunities if they just work hard. And so, but that's not the case. But the self-perception is stronger than us believing in the facts. So even though year after year we've seen Denmark drop down on the list from, for example, the World Economic Forum's gender index report, or gender gap index report, but we don't really recognize that. It's kind of like we're blind to it. And so when I entered into a big multinational headquartered in Denmark, leading this work on inclusion and diversity, this was back in 2010, I started there. There was, every time you mentioned something about diversity or equal opportunities or inclusion, there was this misconception that this was about gender equality only, and gender being reduced to something about women. And didn't we fix that in the 70s? And so it's like there was this fatigue around any issue around this, because everybody really generally believed that we already fixed this. There was no issue. And so they were really blind to the numbers. And a lot of times you couldn't even get through with the data, because there was just a blocker in front of them. There was eye rolling, and just like, really, like people were just so disengaged. So changing the entire narrative, self-perception, and discourse around this was really where I had to start. Yeah, so that was interesting to me, where many other countries, also in Scandinavia, with this high level of equality, they had a different perception of themselves. So they kept working on it. They didn't lean back. I think we were the only country in the Scandinavian region, in the Nordics, in 2017, when the Me Too movement globally exploded. We were the only country that actually managed to just silence it. Media silenced it. There was no fuss about Me Too in Denmark. It was just killed. And there's a research report just had come out showing how was that even possible in a country like Denmark? But now, so it came back as a boomerang now last year with a massive Me Too explosion, and now it's different. I think we learned from the first time. So again, something is changing, but keep in mind, 10 years have passed since I, started working internally with this. So it actually took 10 years as a nation to get to the point where, okay, we also have something to work on.
Sam, I think that both of our stories highlight some kind of hidden patterns that we encounter in our work around diversity, equity, inclusion, and perhaps you may see that in your work as well. One is a sense of what would motivate people, and understanding who the people are that we're working with. So if it's a moral stance, or if it's a values-based, or if it's a data-based, or a combination of both. So understanding what motivates the people that you're trying to engage in this work. And then the other thing that Tinna highlighted around this false self-belief that we're there already. And certainly we've encountered that, or I've encountered that with the US, like feeling that, we're leading so strongly on this as well. And then when we look at many factors and indicators around equality, that just doesn't bear out the reality. So false self-belief and understanding motivation of people that you're trying to engage and work within that are really key areas that we've had success in engaging people in the work on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of reminds me of when Barack Obama was chosen. It was such a monumental thing, for a person of color, but people thought racism was suddenly solved because he had a person of color becoming the president of the US. And it's the same, you know, in organizations that we work with, you know, just because you have a strong presence of female leaders, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a complete a problem that is solved. So, I mean, both of you have seen, you know, large organizations, corporates, public organizations, NGOs, you work with individuals. When there is a big culture change, you start where, what does good look like? And that's what I was also really curious to understand from you both, from your years of experience. You know, when it looks, obviously there's nobody that does it perfectly, but what does good look like for those companies or organizations that are actually driving D&I initiatives in the right way then? Or governments for that matter.
Tinna, you want to go on that, or?
Yeah, so I actually think that is really, really interesting, because a lot of time as change makers, we also have a misconception, and we think we can go in and predefine this, you know, based on what research shows.
Yeah.
And you can come in with the first, you know, 30, 40, 50 arguments from research showing what does good look like, but that doesn't make people act like what good looks like. I mean, so that identifying that and figuring out what is the kind of person people aspire to be, or what kind of workplace would actually make a difference for them, or what way of collaborating would actually make them feel they will not only listened to, but actually heard. I mean, or, you know, like people actually use what they bring in. And so that in itself is a very inclusive process of identifying that and engaging everybody in coming up with what does good look like for us and for me, and being developing the skills to be explicit about that. Because if you anticipate that everybody will know what good looks like for you, we already lost, right?
Yeah.
Because no, I mean, everybody has these different needs and, you know, prerequisites to be a part of something. So again, I think we really already there has a start pattern of trying to pre-identify what good looks like. Our
And
experience.
boy, yeah, do we ever experience that, Tinna?
Yeah, you know, there's all these reports and these policies and all that. This is and they're already in these really nice brochures, and they're often pink colors or like purple colors, and we like already there is a misconception happening in people's mind, because those colors are often associated with women, and then it's reduced to a women's issue. So why don't we just fix the women, and then maybe good will look like good. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So I mean, our experience is that creating long-term inclusive co-creation processes where everybody in very different ways and multiple ways are engaged in identifying this, and also identifying when does it actually work, because we're already doing something that's working for somebody. Let's bring that to the surface so we can scale that up and spread it, because a lot of times it's small, very tangible things people are doing actually that's working well, but nobody's sharing it. It's just left with those two people or that person doing something good. So making it a part of the culture that people can observe and notice, oh, that is actually working well. And they can call it out in a positive way and say, hey, thank you for giving me that feedback. It actually worked. It actually really made me believe in myself that you said that to me. Or thank you for, you know, asking me again to repeat what I said and mention that I was interrupted at that meeting. That really felt respectful for me without you shaming somebody else. Thanks. You know, if we were just naturally better at all this, all of a sudden we would be calling out on as an integrated part of the culture, and be explicit, naming the behaviors that are working and not working. But, you know, just making it part of everyday interactions, that is a very powerful way to create changes and be a part of identifying what does good look like here. What should it look like?
Yeah, that's a great capturing, Tinna, of our experiences that we've had. How many times, and Sam, maybe you have that as well, that well-intended organizations come and approach, what's the solution?
Yeah.
What's that magic, bullet? I don't even know where that phrase comes from. Why would a bullet be magic? What's that quick fix?
Bullet.
Somehow like give it to me, the knowledge, and I'm going to go off and do it. And what we keep coming back to is exactly as Tinna just described. It's the process of reflection, observing the patterns, having a mandate for change, because sometimes you don't even have that. And it's kind of a performative request around give us a solution. When we aren't really being set up to implement that and adapt it to our own context.
But Sam, I actually also think, because a part of why Lisa and I developed this change and design methodology we call inclusion nudges is also to design eye-opening interventions that can show people what good does not look like. And also, because a lot of times we do so many things with the best of intentions, and we actually think we're doing good. At least we have a good intention of, and then we're blind to the fact that our behavior is slightly off from what we intend to, be a part of. And then, so what we do is often we take those insights about what people are actually doing in their behavior, and then we show it in a way that is eye-opening, or it gives this aha moment, or this, what, this is crazy, we do this? I didn't even know. And then this is actually what we call a feel the need nudge, because it targets the part of the brain that's driving our behavior on an unconscious level. And it kind of triggers an emotion, or like a surprise, or people get annoyed with seeing that, or they get really intrigued or curious, or they lean in instead of just lean back and be like, "What, we got this, right? Somebody in HR is going to fix this." So you get them to lean in and be like, "Hey, okay, I really don't like that my brain collectively with all the other people who just experiences that our brain gave us this message and showing us that what we do is actually off. It's not creating something good for the greater good of all of us." Or, you also know from your work is if, an organization say we want global mindset, that's a very important skill, for example. And then everybody's starting being measured on global mindset. And a lot of them, they turn out in those assessments that they're actually doing well in global mindset. But when you then do some of these interactive exercises with them, they realize that they just rated, people that they only saw in a split second. They just rated them either competent or incompetent. And that was completely based on things like their hair, a tattoo, a crooked nose, a piercing, tall, short, and it's like, or dark skin or light skin. And the surprise of that makes them go like, maybe I don't have such a global mindset. Or what does global mindset actually mean? Let's not focus on what the assessment says. Let's focus on what does that mean in our behavior. And now you have a movement happening, an engaging movement, because people are curious now to actually live up to their intentions.
And it was interesting because I wanted to discuss a few things that you actually noted down in the book, because they were really interesting. I said there's one specifically for talent selection, and I did want to sort of pick your brains a little bit on it, because one of the things that I think relates to that is that you actually, again, we're an executive search business and we see a lot of CVs, but you're actually proponents of no CVs. So I wanted to see if you can elaborate a little bit as to, again, in the context of what Tinna just mentioned, maybe Lisa, if you can elaborate a little bit as to what made you come up with that solution? What is the results that you maybe would see or have seen from organizations that have gone down that route as well?
So to set first the broader context, so the inclusion nudges was born out of Tinna and my experience with behavioral science and applying that in our work as internal change makers in multinational organizations at the time, for inclusion, equity, and diversity.
Yeah.
And we came together and we said, we really need to do something in this field. We were encouraged by many of the leading thinkers in the field of behavioral economics to go forward and do something, because there wasn't really something organized in this way towards our profession of inclusion, equity, and diversity. So we started out by sharing designs that we had been applying. And this is a critical piece, that the work that we do is very much grounded in science, but it's also about practical application. And that early stage of our work over 8 years ago about first the two of us coming together, and then across our network sharing the examples, has grown to more than 9,000 people around the world in the Inclusion Nudges community. In our Inclusion Nudges books, the guidebook and the action guide series, which you reference the talent selection, and there's one for motivating allies, and there's one for leaders. Those examples come from Tina's experience, my experience, as well as many people in the community sharing their experiences. So that no CV one came from one of the members in the community. But let me share with you how I positioned that 2 days ago with a senior leader in a very large multinational in the finance sector. He was talking about, he's a very senior level and he has an opening on his team, and they rarely come up for the executive position and really want to be committed to try and increase the diversity profile that they have in that position. And he was talking me through, and he said, it's been posted and it's internal. I think he was doing the parameters of an internal search. He said, and I got 6 CVs. And he said, part of me felt good that I got 6 applications, and part of me felt disappointed that I only got 6 applications. And I said, yeah, my initial reaction too is that's kind of a small pool. What's up with that? And he started talking me through, okay, so when you do the numbers, and he was quickly doing, I'm sure you've heard this anywhere, executive search and doing numbers. As the funnel comes down, he said, there's probably ultimately about 18 people who are qualified for that position. And I said, you know what? Why don't you just take all 18 people and consider them in the pool? Don't wait and put it on the shoulders of people to have to apply for the position. Flip it and say, this is another inclusion nudge, everyone in that 18 are qualified. Now let's go through and review and look at very objective criteria that we have in place. What are we looking for? What have we overlooked within this population? Perhaps there are other reasons that people have pulled back and not applied, somehow doubting that they would even be considered. So let's get rid of that kind of the equivalent of self-silencing and make sure that we review everyone who could be qualified for the role, and just use that as a starting point rather than the CVs piece. So the example that you referenced of no CVs is one organization that actually does no CVs. The person who's the recruiter assumes everyone is qualified who meets it, and then just the names are put forth, the interviews are scheduled, and the hiring manager and the hiring team don't see the CV, and they then do the interview by objective questioning. And the purpose for that is to try and reduce the, all the cognitive biases that crop up when we evaluate talent, like affinity. Oh, we went to the same school. Oh, we came from the same country. And that can boost or be to the detriment of candidates and really interfere with good decision-making on talent.
Yeah, no, and I said I know some of those conversations, and I think it obviously will depend on the industry and the type of role and sort of how those things can work. But I thought that was a really interesting one when I was reading through it, because we do start to see CVs are being digitized more. Than there's algorithms coming in, and there's going to be selecting of people that are no longer done by other humans, right? So I think there's going to be an added complexity of how do we solve that problem.
And we know there's bias in those algorithms.
Yeah, as well. Because they're done by humans, right? So I think that's for sure one. There's another one I picked up on, and maybe Tina, you can give me your thoughts on this one, because you, again, not necessarily going against diversity targets, but you said instead of framing it as, aiming for 30% of females leaders on the board or something of that nature, to do it 70% homogeneity of teams, and that's going to lead to better results. So I wanted to see if you can also double click on that and elaborate more on why you feel that's a good that's a good reframing of those targets.
Well, yeah, so this was actually a big part of the work I did in terms of changing the narrative and the discourse and misconception about we already have equal opportunities, and also that unconsciously, when you set a target for 30% women in management, you do it with the best of intentions to create a better gender balance. But the problem is you keep maintaining and reproducing a misconception that this is about women. And that actually means that a lot of time organizations, they keep focusing on trying to improve women because there is this misunderstanding that women are not already ready to move to that level. That's why they're not there. So let's give them some female leadership program, or let's give them, some kind of mentoring that can improve their skills. When we do other kinds of designs, you will very fast realize that a lot of the women who are not moving up are better, have more merits than some of the men who are moving up. So it's not because they don't have the skills. So what we did in the organization was we wanted to move as far as way of targets like that, but we wanted to make sure that we tapped into all the evidence about when do teams actually perform the best, like what defines high performance teams and teams that are innovative and where people feel like more safe to speak up and not self-silence, and where the team is better equipped to actually use all like diversity of thinking and perspectives and know-how in the team. So when you look into the data, it turns out that it's often when there's a critical mass of diversity, and that critical mass is 30%. But when you look deeper into the data, it is actually when the homogeneity is reduced. The homogeneity of thinking, the homogeneity of gender, the homogeneity of educational background, the homogeneity of what ethnicity people have. So we actually changed it and said, let's create high-performing teams. Let's compose high-performing teams by design and not randomly. And let's aim for maximum 70% of the same gender. Maximum 70% of the same generation, maximum 70% of the same ethnicity or country, maximum 70% of the same, educational background, or if data showed there was a preference for people from the same kind of the three same kind of universities, or the university of the most senior, then you would put that in maximum 70% from the same university, or, and in this way we would embrace everybody. Because there are also functions in an organization, for example, the HR function that is, often dominated by women, and or marketing, often dominated by women in a lot of the organizations I've been in. So, but in this way, it wasn't about men or women. And in this way, you would also embrace the fact that there are people who do not identify as men or women. So you, in that way, you embrace much more diversity without having to like tick a box for she's lesbian, or he's non-binary, or because where would you get that data? It's like a lot of organizations are not allowed to report or measure on ethnicity. It's illegal. So in this way, what the managers did, because this totally resonated with them, they loved it. For the first time, they leaned in when there were diversity targets communicated, because it wasn't about diversity as such. It was, but it was also about high performance, and it was about innovation. And, so this really made sense for them, because these were things that they were all really aspiring to be, that kind of leader who had a high performing team. And so what really was fascinating to me was the managers immediately picked up on this. And there was one manager who himself developed this, it was just like an Excel spreadsheet, really. And he just made a little tool where he said, how many is in my team? And then it said, how big is the majority? Like, so, and how big is the majority on gender, the majority on ethnicity, the majority? He was just looking for percentage. He just wanted to know. So it wasn't about if you were Turkish or Danish or Australian. It was about, you know, because he knew his team. I mean, he was a manager of 10 people. And so it's okay if he didn't guess it right. Like, he could also guess himself in terms of, you know, what gender people identify with, but it was easy for him to just plug it in. And then he had evidence when he would go into a hiring decision, because it would be a qualified decision-making process. And he would look at the numbers and say, I see that we have, you know, 90% of homogeneity on educational background. And we're moving into this market. I know we need a bigger diversity on educational background or generation, or and now here we have two equally qualified candidates on the, you know, on paper and in terms of merits, but we now have to make a decision, because this person will challenge us and change our numbers on generation, and this person will change the balance on gender. We can't have both in this particular situation. So let's figure out, is it gender now? When we know the research about how big a difference it makes in terms of gender, but maybe it's generational difference that's bigger for us right now, because we're trying to target a younger audience. We don't have enough insights about that. We need somebody from a different generation than the 90% from generation baby boomer or whatever, you know. So in that sense, he just developed that tool. I was like, that's brilliant. It is so simple, but it actually made that target more tangible for him. And it really did change the discourse in the organization.
Yeah. Look, and I said, there's a lot of things, again, just because it's my day to day, there's a lot of suggestions in there that I just completely, once I think about it, you know, I could certainly see how they work, but it's going to be a long, hard slog to get to where we need to end up. But I think it's positive to see how some of these things have already been working in the organizations you do. And again, we'd probably need a whole day or probably more than that to go through all the ones you recommend. But I do think there are some really interesting ones, and we'll be putting links so that people can obviously read up on them themselves. But in terms of where we are now, because it's been such a, you know, monumental year, 2020, and again, you guys have been working in this for a number of years, and there's elements of things that have just come to the boil with in a lot of countries. You know, it's now public discourse. We see a lot of D&I being at the top of the list with a lot of organizations. Given where we are now, I just want to know, do you feel positive about the future, about where we're going? I mean, I know your goal, you feel passionate that this could really change organizations, change the world if we would really embrace, you know, a lot of the things on the Inclusion Nudges books, but also the initiatives. Do you see there being a positive direction which we're going in as we stand today? How do you guys feel about the future?
And Sam, I think you used a really important word, and that's a long, hard slog. How long have we been working on diversity, equity, inclusion in a formalized way in organizations? I don't know, there's talk that maybe Xerox started some work in the 60s around this, then IBM and HP came in the forefront in the 70s. And this is within a US context. And then kind of we saw in the 80s and the 90s kind of a globalization in these multinational organizations. And then various government initiatives kind of hit around the 90s and into the noughts, you know, in terms of legislation and equalities. And then we have social movements that have happened in civil rights and human rights and various streams and corporate responsibility. So there's many streams of how the work has been approached. And yet we're still here doing it. And why is that? Well, because it's a long, hard slog, as you just said. It has been incredibly difficult, and difficult by our own making, perhaps sometimes by the language that we use, and it kind of excludes people and creates kind of this sacred circle of those in the know get to use this language. Or it's been reduced down to measures and compliance and legislation, or it's been categorized as blaming and shaming majority groups and then distancing them. Or as we've actually seen, and there is a history there, performative. So yeah, many companies are vocal right now, perhaps on the Black Lives Matter. And it's not just a US conversation, but we know, Black Lives Matter demonstrations were in over 80 countries worldwide. We know skin color bias is universal. This is a world area of inequality to be addressed. So why are we still struggling with this if we've had decade after decade after decade and good intentions? And that's what led us to start the inclusion nudges piece. When it's difficult, when we've got these hidden barriers, when we don't have a clear mandate for change, when we don't see our own patterns, and when we haven't spoken to the large part of the brain, the unconscious fast brain that's doing the decision making, we're going to be constantly tripping up and tripping up over ourselves. So that's why these designs and nudging and behavioral science is so critical, because it's about how do we work and speak to the part of the brain that is driving the behavior, the unconscious part, the system one and Daniel Kahneman's framing. How do we put in designs that are based on data and evidence about actual patterns and intentions of where we want to go and what are the gaps? And then how do we have a culture of truly experimentation and coming in and rolling up our sleeves and saying, let's adapt this to our context, as Tina referenced earlier in our conversation. Every good practice or design needs to be contextualized to the situation. And then that's our intent, and a lot of these designs that are behavioral science based are not big budget initiatives. They're not ways that would be a barrier to start implementing them in organizations. Yeah. And that's what motivated us in doing this work and collecting examples, experimentation and adaptation from people. We've scripted out the examples, step by step in the guidebooks and in the action guides so that people can take that and adapt it. And the initiative is based on sharing and reciprocity. So we want to hear back from other people and how did it go? And the whole intention is to inspire and change how we approach this work. So it's not a long, hard slog. Yeah. And we're not tripping up over ourselves.
Yeah.
I definitely believe, and I think, I know that Lisa believes in this as well. If every human being on this planet just knew a little bit more about how the human mind works, then and we're just on the basic level able to apply some of those insights about how we as human beings operate and what's driving our behavior. If we just humans knew a little bit more about humans, we would see so much change.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to convince everybody this is important. You can really just design a lot of the things that we do in a way where we automatically get people to be inclusive, including ourselves. I mean, so again, we can really design our way out of this by applying insights about human beings. And so that's really, in essence, the core of the mission we're on, is to spread that insight about us as human beings, help and enable and empower people to apply that. And I really, we so believe that this is possible, to the level of being idealist and naive, but this is really what gets us up in the morning and just keep going, also when it's tough.
Yeah,
I really believe in this.
Yeah, and I think I can see it through, right? I mean, you guys have done remarkable work, and I think again the book has a really provides a lot of really actionable things that organizations, even individuals, can do to just ensure that hopefully that changes incremental day by day, and hopefully that leads to the bigger change that we can see in organizations. So
I mean, Sam, I'm sure that you have not had clients that come to you and say, Sam, get me a candidate who's just like me.
Yeah. Well,
don't look at other people. Just bring me the one person who's just like me. No, I mean, our intentions are generally very good to seek out the widest possible talent for the best benefit of the organization.
Yeah.
But we know our behavior pulls us to people just like ourselves.
Yeah.
And so that's the piece, where everyone, yourself and all of us who are here in this conversation virtually, have a way that we can contribute to try and shake that up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, as you said, that system one, the one that makes it, we want to go for the easy solution. And even I was maybe a little biased in sort of asking for an easy, well, what does good look like? Sort of asking for a distilled, very simple way of looking at things when we're looking at a complex problem. And it's hard to sort of make that step change, to sort of be a little bit more mindful of how we're, going about our business, these regular interactions. So,
how we frame up that question sometimes is diversity and inclusion are not the end goal. They're the enabler to get to what, and the what is the contextualization of the organization. So what is it that they're seeking? Better innovation, growth, new perspectives being shared. Okay, so that's what they want. And then how do we apply designs that are leveraging the vast range of talent out there and the culture that is appreciating and utilizing and tapping into that talent? So a lot of times we're not even using the words diversity and inclusion, but it's around where are we heading to?
Yeah.
And how can we apply designs to help us get there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, Tinna and Lisa, thank you so much for your time. It's been obviously a pleasure. I mean, we could have probably done this for hours, but I said I certainly recommend anybody to read the book to sort of get more information on all the work that Tinna and Lisa have done and what they recommend. But thanks again for both your times.